things in our particular field are changing rapidly. This is a lot different. We were just talking about Hebrew a minute ago. This is a lot different from Hebrew, which is the same as it was, back in Moses' day, as far as Hebrew is concerned, right? What they speak today has changed, but obviously. But in our particular field, the changes are drastic and they are quick. This is a book review from the Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. It's written by a fellow named John, and I guess you pronounce his last name Cakes. It says, "How should we live? A practical approach to everyday morality." Okay? It's a 3-page review that I'm not going to read for you. Neither the words Jesus nor Christian are in this review. So right off the bat, that ought to tell you, this is kind of a humanistic, sort of philosophical sort of morality. This is not Christian ethics. This is a quote from the book. "I often see people propose to us patterns of life which neither the proposer nor his hearers have any hope of following, or, what is more, any desire to follow." People don't want to practice what they preach, right? And there's a motto that sort of follows, and I'm going to cut way through this, but the guy who is reviewing this book says there's a sustained critique of ideal and absolutist, and we'll see that in a few weeks, theories of morality, and indeed of theories of morality of any kind. Anti-theory theories of morality, the author suggests, are perhaps better than pro-theory theories of morality. But best of all is to have no theory of morality at all. And I'm sure he's going to sell a lot of that. I ran across this one today, dated March the 2nd. If those of you that can read this, anybody see this? "Why Our Children Don't Think There Are Moral Facts." I printed this off. It's 6 pages, so if you want to just type that in, this is from the New York Times. Deals a lot with moral relativism and things like that. And it just starts off, "What would you say if you found out that our public schools were teaching children that it is not true, that it's wrong to kill people for fun or to cheat on tests?" Killing people for fun is not wrong. And the American public school system is teaching that. Now, they'll send you to jail, but it's not wrong. This is, like I said, this is the New York Times, right? He says, "As a philosopher, I already knew that many college-age students don't believe in moral facts. While there are no national surveys quantifying this phenomenon, philosophy professors with whom I have spoken suggest that the overwhelming majority of college freshmen in their classrooms view moral claims as mere opinions that are not true or are true only relative to a culture." Again, we'll come back to that later on in the semester when we get into moral relativism. But it's just a scary thing to realize that within the academy, much less within the public school system, morals are relative. Ethics are optional. Some of you may have just heard this in the last couple of days. Massachusetts prosecutors say a troubled teen took his own life after exchanging texts with a fellow student who egged him on to do it. I don't know if any of you all saw this on the news or anything like that. This is kind of like a girlfriend. I'll cut it way short, but in essence, he was sitting in his car, motor running, trying to asphyxiate that way, and had second thoughts, got out. This girlfriend, who just so happened to work for a suicide prevention center, urged him to get back in his car. Go through with it. Do it. It's almost like, folks, it's almost like the young people of today, these are 18-year-olds, right? They're so influenced, but they think that life has a restart button on it. Game over. Life is a video game. And all you have to do is just punch a button and start another game. So let's go commit suicide. That'll be fun. Instead of attempting to assist him or notify school officials, a counselor, a family member, anyone, Miss Carter, is alleged to have strongly influenced his decision to take his own life, encouraged him to commit suicide on multiple occasions, and guided him through the process. Now, this is going to lead us into where we're going today, but what I want you to see with all this is the slippery slope on which we find ourselves. If there are no moral absolutes, then you can tell your friend to commit suicide. Now, unfortunately for her, there are legal problems. It is still against the law to do this. She's 18 years old. She may spend the rest of her life in jail for this. Those of you who are youth ministers probably have to deal with this on a fairly regular basis. So, I don't think, it's real easy to understand when we talk about the sanctity of life and connecting that with abortion. It's difficult because how many of you know the first thing about death? Obviously you don't, because you're breathing. Some of you might say, well, I watched my grandmother die. But what do you know about life ending? You don't. You might know about her life ending. You've never experienced it. There's a time when you want to think that if your grandmother is really sick, and I think Dr. Geisler goes over this, you really want grandma out of pain and suffering. And wouldn't it be nice to just give her a shot, just like you would do your dog, have her go to sleep and never wake up? The problem with that is twofold. First off, it's illegal. Secondly, you ain't God. AIN''T. You ain't God. So, what I want you to get as we go through these slides is there's a different aspect. We normally, as Southern Baptists, we just jump right onto this issue of abortion and sanctity of life and how important that is. A few years ago, I'm going to say by now it's probably about 20 years ago, where I live over in Plano, we went through a rash of teenage suicides. I mean, it was a flood. When I was on staff at Prestonwood, dealing with older single adults, there was one particular week where I had 5 counseling sessions. This was one of the reasons why I spent some time on this a couple of weeks ago. There were 5 counseling sessions where people wanted to talk to me about suicide. And you can understand a little bit about how this happens. These are people who are 50 years old, never been married, have no hope of having children. Or there was this one particular fellow who had had the same job for 40 years. In an economic downturn, he got laid off. He was 60 years old. Only job he'd ever had as an adult. Now, a lot of these, in the first case scenario, a lot of these people that I chatted with were really just looking for attention. So it's one of the things that I was telling you about. One of the reasons why you have to go into detail about getting somebody to summarize the problem, document something for me a little bit. Don't just start rambling into something. Organize your thoughts. Let me look at this before you come in and sit down. We'll talk about this. This last guy I was telling you about attempted it. On top of losing the only job he'd ever had as an adult, his wife of 40-something years left him. Kids were grown. Grandkids didn't live around. Just decided to take his life. Good news is he didn't do it well. Spent several days in the hospital. 2 weeks later, he tried it again, and this time he was successful. One of the reasons why I put some of that stuff in and you've been through some counseling classes and you understand all that. What I want you to get with all this is people need to feel like they're important to somebody. Your boss lets you go. Your wife lets you go. It's almost like my life is worthless now. There needs to be a minister there to explain to them that, you're an important person. It will hurt me if you go. It will hurt all of the people that are around you. So you'll see the difference here. We make these arguments for capital punishment, and we keep sanctity of life in that process. And then we look at the same thing as far as when we get to euthanasia. Life is important. And it's not our place to, how many of you got somebody's permission to be born? Yeah, that's what I thought. You can't get anybody's permission to die either. Shouldn't. Let's look at this for a second. Scripture makes a clear call in the Old Testament for punishing a murderer by taking his or her own life. Again, I think Dr. Geisler kind of spells this out pretty good. When you go through a lot of this stuff, it's sometimes real easy to just go Old Testament versus New Testament. You have to be kind of careful. Where would Jesus have been on this? A sound argument can be made for the fact that Jesus would not have condoned capital punishment. I said a sound argument. Okay? So regardless of soundness of argument, can we argue from silence? We may not have gone far enough in our logical discussions in week one to get into this. An argument for silence, a lot of times people say, well, the Bible does not say X. That's an argument for silence. So it's kind of hard to argue about what somebody doesn't say or does say, or, you need to have some evidence. And like I was talking about a minute ago with Grandma, nobody who has witnessed a loved one endure prolonged suffering wouldn't prefer death. Can you just make this suffering go away? Can't you just let her go? And if someone has the mental clarity to ask for medically assisted suicide, see, this is kind of there. You saw all kinds of in Scott Ray's book. You saw all kinds of different scenarios behind that, and it's just kind of like the divorce thing. We're really just sort of hitting the high spots on this. You can go with this at much greater length. But if somebody is sharp enough to ask for a physician-assisted suicide, why should you be denied? Yeah, I can't remember if I've told you guys this or not, but I lost my mother about a year and a half ago, something like that. She had, as Dr. Ray was describing, she had a living will. She had a living will. No machines, do not resuscitate, anything like that. It's a great story that I don't have time to go into. We just knew she was dead. She rallied. She made it about another 8 months. Mind was sharp as a tack. So somehow in that process, because she had had such improvement, she was talking to the doctors and was saying things like, okay, can I change my mind a little bit? I mean, I don't want you to do anything heroic, but, if there's just a little infection that an antibiotic could clear up, do it. Okay. You can understand that a little bit, can't you? I mean, you're sharp enough what's to go. My sister was telling me my mother passed away before I could get up there. And my sister said there was one time when she just kind of came awake and she looked at my sister and she said, I'm not doing real good, am I? And my sister said, no, ma'am, you're not. And that was the last that she was able to get out. But I mean, at that point, she knew she was still sharp enough. So her brain was there. The rest of her was just shot. So if somebody is sharp enough to say, I want help, don't you think we're sort of obligated to help them? Capital punishment is biblical. Now, if you want to just scratch some of these down, I'll post this. We can come back to it later. This is a long argument. In the Old Testament, all of these things would get someone killed. Murder, cursing or killing a parent. And cursing is not one of the two words that you can't hear on television today. Cursing is bad-mouthing. My mother used to refer to it as back-talking or sass. Kidnapping, adultery, incest, bestiality, homosexuality, premarital sex, rape of an engaged girl, witchcraft, human sacrifices, sacrifice, worship of a false god, blasphemy again, Sabbath violation, contempt of court. I'd have been dead. So, as you kind of glance through that list, aren't you glad you live in the church age? But, and I use this a lot, never forget that grace is not a license to sin. The Apostle Paul deals with this very clearly in Romans chapter 6. What shall we say then? Shall I continue in sin so that grace may abound? Of course not. Because Paul is sort of like anticipating the argument from the other side. Oh, grace. What a great idea. All I got to do is ask for grace. I can live like the devil, sin a lot. Why? I get more grace that way. Paul says it doesn't work that way. We also have to remember to use caution when we're trying to apply the Old Testament laws to the 21st century. All right? This is not new. You've seen this already several times. Great debate exists as to which laws are to be transferred. It's amazing to me you still run into this. People who are just adamant about the fact that, with the exception of what Peter's vision covered and what Jesus may have sort of fixed, if you will, in the Sermon on the Mount, We're to be just like the Old Testament Israelites. I don't get that. Grace is completely different. Everything is, you haven't read much about Paul, I don't think, if you come to that conclusion. Clearly, the ceremonial laws are no longer applicable. Sacrifices are no longer necessary. The church is also not under the civil law, since God deals with the church differently from the theocracy of Old Testament Israel. By the way, what you're seeing in the Middle East with ISIS or ISIL or whatever you want to call it is basically a theocracy. The Quran and those two other little books that go along with it are the law of the land. And by the way, if you've got some friends that sort of are still romanticizing about Islam, understand that it is clearly today within their rights, and in fact is encouraged for them to beat their wives into submission. Now that's alien to us. That we just don't think that way. Thank the Lord. I mean, in 35 years of marriage, I've never hit my wife. These guys do it routinely and think that it honors Allah. It's amazing. So, let's look at John chapter 8. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him. And he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. Having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" They were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard this, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, and he was left alone, and the woman where she was in the center of the court. Straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go. From now on, sin no more." This is a very familiar passage to you. But what you have to see here is that Jesus is making an adjustment. Just because Moses has said that that was the thing to do with a woman caught in adultery, that was for them at that time. But I think it's important to understand the fact that he never comes out and says, just like we were reading just a minute ago, you can kill somebody for fun. Jesus doesn't come out and say, your adultery was okay. He didn't say that it's not sin. But his actions indicate that her sin was no longer worthy of the death sentence. It still required repentance. Right? What does he say to her? Go and sin no more. From now on, don't do this anymore. That's repentance. Those who argue against this point say that this was an isolated instance against the Pharisees trying to trap him. The Samaritan woman at the well deserved also to die by stoning, but Jesus shared the gospel with her and she was saved. Go back in John 4 and read that one. We've gone through this in week 1. We were talking about the Sermon on the Mount, right? But I say, if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery with her. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If he forces you to go 1 mile, go 2. So he was not destroying the law. Oops. That's an interesting Greek, isn't it? I was just talking with Heath about that a minute ago. Can we get this thing? So there's 2 Greek words here. Abolish is kataluo. So if you've had Greek, you recognize your friend luo, which means to loose. And when you add kata against it, which means down or against, the resulting word means to utterly destroy. The second word is fulfill, which is plerao, which Paul uses in Philippians chapter 2. Jesus emptied himself, right, ketosis, but he was filled with the Spirit. He was, plerao doesn't simply mean virtually full or almost full or not empty. It means so full that adding another drop would cause a spill. The law was authored by God, affirmed by the prophets, and accomplished by Jesus. His birth eliminated the existing civil law. His death eliminated the restriction of the ceremonial law. His life provided a new moral code. From John MacArthur's Matthew commentary, we get this. The judicial law and the ceremonial law were fulfilled and set aside. They ended at the cross. But the moral law is still being fulfilled by his disciples, not the 12, me and you. Because Jesus fulfilled the law, so can those who belong to him. And then from Romans 8:3, for what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did. Sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So how do you handle murderers? We've shown how Jesus forgave 2 immoral women, but the number 1 spot on that long list was for murderers. Would he approve of capital punishment for murder, or would he prefer that we handle it differently? What about an eye for an eye? That actually is still used in legal settings today. You have probably, if you've watched Law and Order or something like that, you've heard the Latin phrases quid pro quo or lex talionis. You've heard that. This is not new to you. Basically, it means, you get what's coming to you. Jesus goes on in Matthew 5 to give 4 examples of areas of concern regarding retribution: dignity, security, liberty, and property. These were matters of individual retribution. So, we saw in somebody's reading this week, the difference with a lot of this stuff is the difference between personal liberty and civil responsibility. You and I might have grace about something, but when the state gets involved in executing something or someone, then different things are involved. Different factors get involved in that kind of a mindset. Romans 13:1. Every person, this is very important, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. It is real hard today to submit to some of the governing authorities. Do you see that anywhere? Except when it gets real hard. No, I don't see that either. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. Did you catch that? Real important. If you resist authority. Now, I think Dr. Geisler goes into this, the whole conversation about civil disobedience. Yeah, you got to be careful with this. If you pull it too tightly, what you come away with is the fact that the American Revolution was one big sin. So you have to sort of move off of that spot a little bit, right?
What are the extent of that bishop that will you say the same thing that he said?
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the illustrations that we used the other day was, I think, Dr. Russell Moore was heading in the right direction on the deal about justices should have the integrity to resign. But the problem with that, I think, had he thought through that a little longer, is you'd absolutely have 0 Christians as judges. And that's problematic. I mean, there are few enough of them as it is. So I think you can protest, and I think our Constitution is clear that there are ways to do that. You can express your opinion. Boy, I don't have time for this, but here, let me just throw this out here. You can chew on this later. Somewhere along the way, you in your ministry are going to need to take stands against something or someone, and you've got to make a decision. Is this something that, as Dr. Patterson's older book is called A Hill on Which to Die, right? So is this a hill I'm going to die on? And in his case, it's biblical inerrancy, which was a hill to die on. Let me think of something that happened. Okay. Last year sometime, the CEO of Starbucks came out and said that he was addressing his stockholders, okay? Room full of wealthy people. If you do not embrace gay marriage, sell your stock now. Wow. I haven't been in a Starbucks since then. Now, do I think the Southern Baptist Convention should organize a boycott against Starbucks? No. Because I think there's some civil disobedience that can occur on a big scale and some that can just be on a private scale. And, it's not really necessarily even my job to influence you guys for something that particular. But what I want you to be concerned about is, especially those of you who will one day be senior pastors, when you're giving leadership to an entire body of people, you're going to have to make decisions like this. Something that came up just last week, there was an organization that had begun petitioning major retailers about that Sports Illustrated cover with that girl who was almost completely naked. And what they said was, don't quit selling it, but cover her up. There were some big companies like Walgreens and people like that just said, absolutely not, you're crazy. Have a nice day. But there were some big companies like Safeway. It doesn't mean anything to us around here. In different parts of the country, that's the big grocery store company. They said, sure, we agree with you. We will put a cover over 2/3 of that. You can see Sports Illustrated. You can see the girl's face. That's it. Good. My point in all this is to sort of develop a thirst in you now to engage the public in ethical issues without being ugly about it. We are still, at the end of the day, to be submissive to Barack Obama. Now, I noticed that Dr. Patterson and the president of 5 other seminaries have sent him an open letter encouraging him to take action against ISIS. Is that being civil disobedient? I don't think so. They're asking for his help. They're trying to persuade him. One of the problems, one of the things, I put this on your test for a reason. One of the problems that we have in the Southern Baptist Convention is the people in the pew don't take the time to find out about what's going on in the world. Book reviews. Children are being taught that there's no such thing as moral facts. Girl encouraging suicide. This is all within the last 3 days. If we, as leaders and ministers, ignore this, the slippery slope, folks, gets worse. It's going to get slipperier and it's going to get faster. We have to get engaged in some of these issues. I think I probably had told you, the fellow that I wanted to speak to you a couple of weeks ago has been involved in crisis pregnancy centers. Your church may not have something like that. You may need to know how you start one. Our people are uninformed about a lot of things. We create, and there's nothing wrong with this, don't get me wrong, but we create kind of a holy huddle around the church. It's sort of this, we've kind of turned the church into this incubator, where people come in, we're protected from the outside world. Why? We don't want to get involved in the outside world. That's wrong. Matthew threw a party, remember? And invited the prostitutes and the tax collectors. Come hear about Jesus. So, there's a fine line between submitting to authority and civil disobedience and standing up for biblical principles. And I think it's important for us to know this is where discernment comes. This is what we talked about last week, right? The only way you and I, as leaders and ministers, are going to be able to discern what's going on and what our people need to know about, what they don't need to know about, is to be filled with the Spirit. And then there'll be some things that will come across your path and you'll go, my people need to know about this. What we don't want is a church full of sweet, ignorant people. Are y'all with me on that? Don't walk out of here thinking that the professor's hateful. Because I don't mean that. But I'm just telling you, we have, that's the reason that fellow wrote that book 20 years ago and just absolutely impaled evangelicals. Our people are not smart. What's the next step in that? It's our job to educate them. Listen, we talked about this in week 1. It's a whole lot more fun to talk about eschatology than it is to talk about euthanasia. But a lot of your people don't even know what euthanasia is. And from capital punishment, they could probably go back to the Old Testament and make the argument real quick an eye for an eye. Now, ironically, as you'll see here in a second, I kind of stand by that, but there's more to working through that entire corpus than just that. So let me go through this really quick. A lot of times people point to the quality of life. We talked about that second bullet. If you're mentally challenged, it's a completely different issue. My mother-in-law, not my mother, my mother-in-law, who's been gone for a while now, was in an Alzheimer's home, suffering from chronic vascular dementia, and she passed away just a few days after she turned 95. I met a fellow who lived in that same place, and he was younger than me. And when I first met him, he was walking, he was able to have small talk. He could tell you, but he would repeat the same thing within a 30-second period. I was over there about 2 weeks later. He was no longer mobile. I was there about a month later, and in order to feed him, they had him, if you can imagine, like the board that mechanics will get under a car and work on and stuff like that. They had him on a board at about a 45-degree incline, strapped down, feeding him like that. He was terribly gone. There was another fellow, another lady, who had been in there so long that her family had spent, catch this, $800,000. They had basically spent their entire fortune and had run up large debts to keep Grandma alive. You've got to be prepared for that. You guys are not old enough to remember there's a movie called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? It had nothing to do with euthanasia. It was about a dance marathon. You read a little bit in one of those books about Dr. Kevorkian. So let's take a couple seconds. What if somebody in your church, well, I don't know who 2.0 of Jack Kevorkian is. I'm sure there are people out doing it today. What if somebody in your church says, Pastor, I want to die. I have called Dr. Son of Kevorkian. What do you say? I have no hope of getting better. My quality of life is horrible. My family is going through massive amounts of money. I really want to die, Pastor. What do you say? This is the point where the professor stops and the class offers feedback. I've trained you that well. What do you say? Don't make me point. Pastor, I want to die. What do you say?
I want friend to point out the fact that her or his life is valuable and that terminating his or her life is not the answer for his or her problems. Like there's a church body that cares for that person. There are people that care for them, and try to persuade the person of the fact that his or her life is not meaningless.
Good. What else?
I don't know.
You remember when I spelled out the word ain't a minute ago? What point was I making? Not your call. You didn't ask to be born. You can't ask to die. Wouldn't you really want Grandma to just go to sleep and not wake up? Not your call. Does that hurt? You bet. You bet. My mother-in-law was, like I said a minute ago, she was capable of small talk. She was half crazy. It hurt to be around her. She was not the woman that I had met a long time ago. You just had to wait and trust that God, in His providence, at some time would end her suffering. But it's not our particular point of view. All right, if you want to jot this down, see that very bottom bullet, you can read this at your leisure. This is Kevorkian 2.0. This is the new Dr. Death. So you can probably just do that. ChristianNews.net 2015/01/01, and you can probably find it from there. Okay? 2. Okay. Peter Singer is the chairman of the ethics department at Princeton. He is probably, unfortunately, the best-known ethicist in America today. He's written a paper called Heavy Petting. He actually endorses bestiality, catch this, as long as it doesn't hurt the animal. His premise is the destruction of speciesism, which assumes human superiority over animals. Do you get that? Do you get that? He is all against the fact that as you and I are just animals. There's no difference between us and the little squirrel that runs across the street. Okay. This is a fairly easy argument to defeat. Animals were not created in the image of God. Now, you're probably sick of hearing the phrase image of God, but you'll hear a lot more of it. The animals don't have the rational, moral, or social capacities to enable them to have a relationship with God. I've been really trying to teach my dogs how to pray, but it's not working. Any of you got some success in that? You got any ideas? Let me have them. We kneel by the side of the bed, and he'll kind of jump up on it with us, and just doesn't quite work. All right. In 2 minutes, let's palliative care. Palliative care is not a panacea. Anybody know what that is before? That last bullet kind of, I think, no. Somebody summarize that for you, just so you can stay awake a little bit, right? What is palliative care? Yeah, it's end-of-life care. What that says is kind of like the illustration I was giving with my mother a few minutes ago, but it was sort of like palliative care is like no help whatsoever. Food, water, that's it. If you get an infection, no antibiotics. If you're a diabetic, no insulin. We're just going to keep you comfortable until you die. And it's an important thing that's growing rapidly, because why? People are living longer. But we're living longer diseased. We're living longer, but we're not aging any better. And it's causing problems. Okay. Catch that verse in the middle there, that Acts 17, the God who made the world and all things in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He served by human hands as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. Then God should be the one who determines the time to die. There's your response to your church member who says, Pastor, I want to die. We think of autonomy as a good word within the Southern Baptist Convention. If you're a supporter of euthanasia, what that basically means is that all humans have the right to make his or her own decision and dispose of his or her own life in the manner that he or she sees fit. That's autonomy. What that says is it is my call. Oh, one other point. I mean, we'll tell you this. Again, it's kind of a personal illustration here. But my dad died quite early. He died at 65. He's been gone a long time now, since 93. Okay. Let me see if I can condense this for you. In the process, my mother had some decisions to make. He was on a respirator. Again, he's only 65, but he can't breathe without this respirator. And at some point in time, my mother made the decision to take him off. Because they had already had this agreement, right? It was real easy for her to pull the plug on him, but on her, she had changed things a little bit. I'm not criticizing that. That's just kind of human nature, I think. But you can imagine, I'm driving 500 miles. It was some of you remember the Leon Lett Super Bowl or Ice Bowl on Thanksgiving. I'm driving 500 miles pretty much on ice to get there before my dad died. And then in the process, after he's gone, we kind of find out that my mother had given the instructions to pull the respirator. Well, I was indignant. I said, "You didn't call me. You didn't call my sister." And she looked at us very firmly and said, "Not your call." I shut up. She's right. It's my call on my wife. It's not my call on my dad. Did I appreciate it? No, but it's her call. Be prepared for that, folks. Prepare your people for this. It's real easy to stand on your pulpit and preach against abortion. This kind of stuff gets a little tougher. Everybody wants grandma to quit suffering. Absolute freedom is a fable for the atheist as well as the believer. The atheist has civil restrictions. We talked about this, right? God is not free to sin. His nature will not allow it. You really need this one in your sleeve somewhere in your ministry. 2 Timothy 2:3, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. It's not a license to sin. Liberty is not a license to sin. We do not have the freedom to decide what to do with our lives. Whether you do the suicide or whether you have a doctor do it, it's not your call. When Jesus chose little children as a model for humility, it had nothing to do with their character, but it had everything to do with dependence. As adults, we are still dependent upon God, not only for our physical provision, but for our spiritual provision in either salvation or for the process of spiritual growth. We can't erase sin by our own accomplishments. We are dependent upon God's grace. We entered the world dependent upon our parents, and we may very well be dependent upon our children or the government as we enter the next life. I tell this unashamedly. I think I've already mentioned this to you. When you're a baby, your parents change your diapers. When they're old, you're going to change theirs. Just be prepared for it. But gratitude is more important than pride. Jeremiah 10:23. I know, O Lord, that a man's way is not in himself, nor is it in a man who walks to direct his steps. And then real quickly before we go, we'll read Job 1:21. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. All right. God willing, I'll see you guys on Thursday.